Hello, everybody, again. My name is Manuela Gerloff. I'm Vice President for Humanities and Social Science Publishing at the Gruyter Press, and I will be representing the Gruyter Foundation today. The Gruyter Foundation is a not-for-profit organization based in Berlin, whose mission is to promote excellent scholarship, particularly in the humanities. And one of our flagship projects supported by the Foundation is the series Humanities for Humans, which is organized in partnership with 1014 in New York. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the already 7th conversation in the series of discussions. For those of you new to the format, in this transatlantic series, prominent experts from a variety of academic fields discuss the most pressing topics of current debates. Regardless of region or continent, we all face a number of existential challenges. The humanities, due to their ability to bridge cultural, regional, or disciplinary boundaries, can enable a more nuanced understanding of our complex world and thus hopefully help foster positive change. As for example, today, where we will investigate ways for turning controversy into connection.
And I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014. You might wonder what 1014 stands for. It is also a nonprofit organization named after its address on 1014 Fifth Avenue in New York. We encourage transatlantic dialogue on pressing global topics. And of course, today's conversation about how to create or recreate positive interchange in democracies is one of these urgent topics. Polarization runs deeply through our Western societies, and with major elections coming up in the United States, Europe, and in Germany, it is, I believe, of paramount importance to re-establish a culture of connection and respect. So I would like to wholeheartedly thank our two renowned experts, Martha Minow and Liz Lerman, for joining us today. And I would also like to extend my sincere appreciation and thanks to Irene Kacandes, Professor of German and Comparative Literature at Dartmouth College, for not only moderating today's discussion, but also curating the entire series Humanities for Humans on behalf of the Gruyter Foundation and 1014. Professor Kacandes is also a series editor at the Gruyter and serves on the board of 1014. And with that, let's get started and jump right into the conversation. Thank you so much.
And thank you both for that welcome and introduction to the series and to today's topic. I offer a very warm welcome to our online audience. Good evening, good day, and good morning to you on both sides of the Atlantic and across this entire continent. Please put your questions into the Q&A as they occur to you, and I will pose as many of them as we have time for to our two experts. I hope audience members have also seen the list of readings to help you pursue our topic beyond this session, which, given its length, can only provide directions for thinking and imagining anew about controversy and connection. So let me introduce a little further the experts who are speaking with us today. Liz Lerman is a renowned choreographer, founder of the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, and founder of the Critical Response Process, a method for giving and receiving feedback and critique, especially in relation to the development of artistic works. Though I only made the acquaintance of Ms. Lerman through the planning for this session, I'd like to note that a session on dance was in my original proposal to the funders of Humanities for Humans. I really thought that dance plays a very important role in terms of not humanistic endeavor in general, but also in terms of academic humanities. On a more personal note, I share that even as a young woman, Liz Lerman was interested in the creativity of older adults. She published in 1984 a book called Teaching Dance to Senior Adults. Since I've now joined that group, I'm also grateful for this interest of yours, Liz. For these reasons and many, many more, I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to Humanities for Humans today, Liz. Martha Minow is currently the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard Law School, of which she served as dean from 2009 to 2017. In addition to a prolific career as a legal scholar, she has developed innovative approaches for reconciliation among divided peoples in a number of quite different contexts, like the Imagine Coexistence Program of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Divided Cities Initiative. Early in my own career, I developed a huge admiration for the insights of Professor Minow through a faculty seminar on cultural memory at Dartmouth College, where we discussed her article, Surviving Victim Talk, a brilliant analysis of the dangerous American love affair with claiming victimization that I regret we all can recognize continues into our day. I'm deeply honored that you accepted my invitation to speak in this series, Martha. So let's get this conversation started. We don't have to work very hard at locating controversy, as Dr. Donovan suggested. It fills the radio waves, TV news, internet sites, and of course, newspapers. Consequences of disagreement in the form of the violence of ugly words to the lethal violence of outright war often accompany much of the world's population at our waking and follow us into our restless sleep, if we're able to get any. It won't escape this audience that I did not invite politicians into this conversation today, but rather a legal scholar and a creative artist. Can any course of action, set of attitudes, and behaviors bring us together rather than push us apart? Professor Minow, would you like to get us started?
Well, thank you for that beautiful framing and your very generous introduction, and for this invitation. The chance to talk about this very urgent and challenging subject with my dear friend Liz Lerman is a gift. I don't know that we will solve anything, but we will gesture towards something that's possible. So I am a middle child, which may explain my interest in this subject. But I am also not naive. I too am preoccupied with war. I'm preoccupied with the impact of digital communications on really dissolving the practices of respect that have developed in face-to-face communications. And I think contributed to the polarization that we see in many countries. And the unraveling of just basic norms of listening and being in the presence of others. That I do have a couple examples, though, of where this notion of moving from controversy to connection may become more concrete. So one is a very practical one. I have a friend who's a mediator of divorcing couples. And you know, I don't want at all to minimize war. There's nothing as terrible as war, but the conflict between divorcing couples can be pretty terrible also. And what this mediator had encountered with one couple, they were so mad at each other, they didn't even want to meet in his presence to have a mediation. So he came up with this idea. He said, we'll have a first session at 5 a.m. on Sunday. Immediately, the two of them turned on him. And as they were just badgering him and complaining about it, they joined forces. They found something in common. They had a common enemy. It's a very practical idea, but one that I think about a lot. A more complicated one. So back in the mid-90s, before the United States recognized same-sex marriage, before many countries did, there were conflicts in many parts of the United States over that question. In San Francisco, which has a rather high population of people who identify as LGBT, politically recognized domestic partnerships and also convinced the city of San Francisco to issue a rule saying it would not do any business with any company, nonprofit or for-profit, that failed to provide healthcare benefits for the domestic partners of same-sex couples. Well, in response, the Archbishop of the Catholic Church, and I think some other religious organizations, said, well, that's it. We're just not going to do any business with the city of San Francisco. But the Archbishop at that time was a man named William Lovato. And he had then an idea, and he wrote an article in a magazine about it, in which he said, look, it's would compromise our values to have to comply with this ordinance, so we're not going to. However, the Catholic Church is very devoted to expanding access to healthcare. So please understand that that's where we stand. The mayor was a man named Willie Brown. He read that article and he called up the Archbishop and said, let's talk. And after a series of conversations, they came up with a new rule that said that any company or nonprofit could do business with the city if they provided that employees of their entity had the freedom to specify any person in their household as a recipient of health insurance. So that was big enough to encompass same-sex couples, but also big enough to encompass, you know, a sibling or an elderly aunt or a homeless person who moved in or what have you. That, to me, was such a marvelous example of a real profound conflict coming to some connection. They found a point of agreement. They agreed about expanding healthcare. The Catholic Church did not then and has not now embraced same-sex marriage, but they found another way to work together. And I guess the last one that I'll give, but I'd be interested, Liz, if this strikes anything for you. I remember in college having really what I thought was the most intense argument I'd ever had in my life with somebody in my hallway who loved Ayn Rand, the author, who I just really just find abhorrent, you know, an extreme version of libertarianism. So we're sitting in the hallway arguing intensely. And somebody walked by and said, what are you talking about? And we explained. And then she said, why would you care about that? And I suddenly realized this is the person I disagree with the most, the person who thinks there's nothing here to talk about.
That sounds like a wonderful turning point. Thank you so much, Martha. Liz, would you like to respond to something Martha's just said, or perhaps launch us in a completely different direction?
Oh no, I always love responding to what Martha has to say.
Okay, great.
You know that we are longtime friends, colleagues, and I would say in particular when times are extremely difficult, Martha's one of the people I turn to try to understand both an intellectual and emotional and spiritual level how I can wake up and do something worthwhile. So
the feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah, I think maybe just I think it's interesting maybe just to start with the three things that you raised, the three incidents that you described, and in the first one, what caught my attention is this idea of common ground. In the story you tell, of course, they found a common ground by a shared enemy. But I'm often in situations, and most of my work is small. It's like face to face, it's small groups of people. But in a world in which I'm asked to bring people together who come from different parts of a community or different disciplines, if you're at a university, or different age groups, if it's depending on why people are asking me for this. And often I'll pair people up across their differences. And ask them to find common ground. I give them 5 minutes and they go away and they talk. Okay. And everybody can do it. They always find common ground. And it's stuff like, well, we both like spaghetti or, you know, things like that. I'm not really interested in what they find. I'm interested in how they found common ground. So then I'll ask them, well, how did you do that? And they'll say, well, we asked each other questions. And I said, well, what kind of questions? You didn't ask trick questions. You didn't ask gotcha questions. I mean, you know, well, they characterize, you know, a lot of times it's personal. It's personal. And then the second thing I'll say is, okay, what tone of voice are you using? Are you yelling? Are you trying to dominate? What do you do? And you realize that we have all these skills for finding common ground. We know how to do this way. And yet, why is it in the construct of a lot of our systems, dominance comes with cruelty, comes with loud voices, comes with hitting, comes with, you know, pain. When if you ask people, and I've seen this, I've done this hundreds of times. So there's that. And in the second case, as you talk about same-sex marriage, we had a project up in Vermont during the beginning of the civil unions. If you recall, Vermont was one of the first states to bring up the civil union. We were up there doing a project. The whole project was called Hallelujah, but it was asking communities what they were in praise of. And in this small town of St. Albans, we were they gave us a party. The town was 2 blocks long, and we arrived, and they gave us a party. And this group of older women came up to me and said, "Okay, we have to go." And I said, "Okay, I'm sorry," but they kept saying it, and I finally said, "Well, where are you going?" And they said, "Well, we're going to play cards." It turned out that they had played cards together every Monday night for 40 years. For 40 years. And even there was one day when one of their husbands had died, and they had figured out how to play cards that night. So this was spectacular to me. And I worked with them during the next 18 months. And when we also, though, wanted to spend some time on this civil union question. And we ended up inviting couples, straight couples, same-sex couples, all kinds of couples, and to learn a duet, which was performed to the Song of Songs. So, Martha, when you talked about framing larger, that, this was a way of framing larger, right? Framing big enough, although not as big as I would want to do now, because I would want to be sure to include our Muslim friends too. But in this case, letting this community see this happen in front of them. Well, in the final performance, which was packed, 2,000 people, because everyone to come see all these people, the women were on stage playing cards the whole time. They occupied the corner of the stage, and there they were. And then somebody got up in the audience and asked to marry one of his friend, and they came up on stage in front of everybody, and that began these duets. So what's going on, right? In praise of constancy in the midst of change was what we call this. And that is finding those places in the community that bind and hold us together, even as we acknowledge the extraordinary. And the women weren't all in favor of civil union. That was the thing. They weren't, and a lot of people in the audience knew they weren't. But they still had a big enough embrace. So I feel part of my job is that stretching that embrace that can hold these kind of changes while we try to figure out how to live with them.
Wow, really beautiful. Liz, this idea of time, I think that's such an important dimension of controversy, and even some of the very painful ones we are witnessing at this moment. I think there's a lot of fear. There's fear about change. And where do people put that fear? And so finding a way to build those bridges between the past and the future, absolutely crucial. I also wonder, and I wonder how you've encountered this, whether in that instance of the women who played cards, whether people feel threatened in their own identities by change. And if so, what can be done about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, Martha, you raised the things I'm almost thinking the most about right now, partly because I'm now full-time at a university, and I'm actually able to live in an environment where the hierarchy and the certain systems are in place. So you can even see in your own life the nature of difficulty of change. It's not just theoretical. But I find one thing is, in some of the work I do, especially with critical response, is to try to get people to speak from experience, not from authority. Mm-hmm. Like, if you can, and I know this is hard, I'm even thinking about our beautiful introductions, which are wonderful, but I rarely call myself an expert. That is to say, I don't find that actually a helpful description, because I'm going to speak not because I have expertise, but more from what has happened, like I just did, these stories that come up because we all live a life, So how do we speak from our experience and strip ourselves of our authorities? And I know that for some people that is terrifying, and we see that all around us, how hard that is.
So if I could just interject here very briefly, because teaching at Dartmouth College as I do, I experienced the whole period of civil unions in Vermont that you referenced, Liz. And one of the things that was very, very interesting to me were the number of people who came out to their neighbors at that moment. And what I heard multiple times was, oh, I didn't know that person was gay. Of course I like that person, or I didn't know her mothers were two, right? That she had two mothers and not a mother and a father. And that it was when Vermonters realized that they were addressing an issue that was affecting their neighbors, they responded to the idea of neighbor rather than the issue of civil unions. So I think that's an important dimension, maybe to bring out, of the finding of a shifting of framework, perhaps we could put it, shifting from, as you just suggested, authority to experience. Oh, I have experience with this neighbor. I'm not afraid of this neighbor. I just didn't know that this male neighbor has a boyfriend, right? That kind of thing. So that's very, very helpful. Yeah.
That's really great and useful, because how do we, more than we currently are able to, get behind these divisive phrases, communicative patterns that people push each other away rather than find some commonality? And actually, Liz, you mentioned critical response. This is, if you would explain that, because to give criticism to people in a way that they can hear it, if we can do that, then maybe we can bridge all kinds of divides.
Yeah, and I think too, just so we don't lose the thread, if we can return, I'm happy to do that. I love talking about critical response, but I want to also just speak, maybe for a minute too, when people are afraid, what happens? And I feel like this is where creativity is so powerful.
Yes.
People felt that they owned their own creativity. Then you don't have to get rid of the fear, but you can partner the fear. You can harness the fear. You can harvest it. There's so many ways to work with this. And right after 9/11, I was interested in how many people were writing poetry all of a sudden. And the USA Today was publishing those poems regularly. And I thought, oh, what's happening is people are, this is the only thing they know how to do now. They're terrified, so they're turning to this. We don't have to wait till we're that scared. And actually critical response is a useful way to think, because a lot of people maybe don't turn to their own creative selves because we're fragile. We are. And some teacher or some parent or somebody, you can't do this. And suddenly, you feel like you can't, but we can. I'll just say critical response is a series of, it's a formal process for giving and receiving feedback, but inside the process are a series of values. So you don't have to do the whole process. If you understand the sort of sequence of values, you can use it in multiplicity of ways, although most people come upon it as a 4-step process. I'll do it very fast. I'll just say though that in dance, you practice the steps, but dancing is not about the steps. It's about much more than that. And it's the same with critical response. We practice these steps because it's a way to practice, but it's really not about the steps. It's about what's inside the steps. So the first step, which a lot of people struggle with the most, is letting, you see a work in progress, or you've been at a meeting and you wonder if you spoke all right or not. The first step is to let people know that what they just did was meaningful. It is not a compliment. It isn't, I like your shoes. It's not. It's something that happened in that moment that is meaningful to you. It can be interesting, provocative, surprising, delightful. And getting people both to be able to see these things, but also receive it. We ask in that first step not to bring up the things that are problematic. I'm not saying not to have them. You can really struggle with a thing that just happened and you think there are a lot of problems in it. You just don't lead with it. Don't lead with it. And honestly, it's such a different world when that takes place. And I've been in nursing homes, where I've been in these places because of my work with older people. And, people are in these institutions for 10, 15 years. And honestly, nobody talks like this to each other. Like, it was really interesting to me when I see you have a new photograph up from your family who is, like that. So that's the first step. And then quickly, or maybe do you want to respond to that? I don't know, Martha, is that something?
No, that's great. Go ahead.
Just keep going. So in the second step, the person who's made the work asks questions of their own work. I noticed watching people get up at work in progress events or almost like poetry readings or anything, people usually apologize right at the beginning. It's not this. And I started thinking, wait a minute, dignify the apology, turn it into a question. So the rest of critical response is inquiry based. I know my own problem. Let me raise it first. And the rule is the responder needs to respond. They can say it isn't good. They can respond with a negative thought, but they can't change the subject. So if that's the main thing, right? If I say to you, how do you like the ending of my dance? You can tell me you don't like it, but you can't say the ending of my dance is fine, but I don't like your hair. I mean, I didn't give you permission, but this is where so many things go off the rails. Off the rails. Parents, I like to say, Anna invites me, my daughter, into her room to help with her homework. Fine. Doesn't give me permission to tell her to clean up her room. I mean, that wasn't the contract. That wasn't the invitation. And we all know what happened. Slam door. Oh, by the way, no homework and no clean room. So listen, it's a listening thing. And you said that right away, Martha. The first thing you talked about in this was listening. So I said, and now quickly, because our time is so short, but the third step, the responders get to ask their question. And here the challenge is to try to make their questions neutral or to stay curious or to gather information. So you can ask, it's just not to embed your opinion in the question that you're posing to a person. And then the last step is, I have an opinion about this particular thing. Would you like to hear it? So statements of meaning. The artist or the maker asks their questions, the responders ask their questions, and then there's permissioned opinions. That's the process.
So this is so helpful to have you just give us that outline. I think some of us are familiar with some of it, but just having it there together. So I'm going to up the ante, so to speak, and say, I can really see how that works with the child and the homework and with the creative work and getting feedback. What happens with something like Israel-Palestine if I want to take this to the into the heavens or into hell, as the case may be? Martha, you've done so much work in international relations. How do we take these principles that make so much sense when we think about them in our everyday lives and try to apply them to these situations that seem insoluble or are being solved by terrible physical violence and destruction?
Well, first, let me say I don't have answers, but I have questions. One question is, who's the we in that? And in relationship to that, there ultimately one hopes will be some kind of a diplomatic solution that someday, we don't know when, whether it's this year or 10 years from now, there will be an end to violent conflict killing each other. Who's going to do that? Who's going to be willing to do that? I don't know. But at some point, it's going to be human beings will have to sit down together and figure out a modus vivendi. How do we live together? I do know people who are starting to talk about that, but most of the political leaders who are relevant are not. But I think there's another we, and it's the rest of us who are not in those roles. In college campuses in North America, we are divided as more than any time that I can remember, maybe, on exactly these issues. But we could do something that would involve listening to each other, hearing, what does this mean for you? Being curious, locating the judgments part of the conversation, not at the beginning, not leading with that. I think that this is true for people who live in Israel and live in Gaza as well, many of whom know each other, have long known each other, are neighbors, but haven't found a way to actually interact. It's true in Europe. There are people I know in France who are having exactly this problem with neighbors. Can they even talk to each other? So who's the we is my question. But once we locate that the we includes some people who, are neighbors and had things in common in the past, I think that these steps are very, very relevant. I've had fascinating opportunities to watch up close as people emerging from terrible conflicts take those small steps, whether it's through a formal process like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or it's by cooperating around some shared goal, like building a community center. And those are steps that people can take and do take if they see a common ground, if they see some reason to have common ground. One of the tragic, terrible features of the Israel-Gaza story is that we have not just recent, but long-standing history of leaders who don't want a solution, leaders for whom the investment in the conflict is part of their own personal power. And as long as that's the case, we can't have these steps. And it'll take other people who say no more, and change who the leaders are.
That's a very sobering thought, because as Katja Donovan mentioned at the beginning, several major parts of the world are facing elections, right? And the choices seem to be between people, as you put it just now, who don't seem to want resolution, versus people who maybe do want resolution and working together. Liz, you travel and work with so many different people. How do you see this scaling up happening? Is there something that the little folk, which is what I'm feeling like right now, very little, is there something that I need to be doing to create the path towards the scaling up of these wonderful practices that you've shared with us?
Well, I share with Martha this sense of it's just so big, and what I might propose is small. I do want to say that Martha has guided me in the past at difficult moments, and that your book, Martha, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, to me is one of the most powerful books I have read. And you specifically helped me through a couple of projects, showing me some ways in which I might express something. I don't want to just say of hope. It's more of practice. It's like a way to practice the thing, including what you did during Small Dances About Big Ideas in relationship to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think my university, Arizona State University, is an amazing place, but it scales constantly. The whole idea is scale up, scale up, scale up, scale up, scale big, scale big. And there's fruits from that in terms of access. The people that we have, so many more people at this university doing so many amazing things, and so many students from around the world. And you can see there are ways you open it out and things happen. But there's also a scale, and the other scale is microscopic. And that that's also really important. And figuring out, again, as you started, Martha, with a couple that's, distraught. The situation right now in Gaza is so horrible. And for somebody like myself, an American Jew, Martha, an American Jew, this is why My Body is a Library, which is this new project I'm working on, feels so true to me, because I am carrying, when Abraham died, his two sons were in that cave with him. And they have, the question I keep asking is, were they already on distinct paths? Were they already separating their burial practices from each other? But how early did this all go? So there's that question. And I feel like I'm living with that in my body. I do think not at the political level, but at every other level, we can be making connections, working through things. One of them with our students, helping people de-escalate the speed with which the anger comes up. That's another thing a critical response can help with. It's like a de-escalation of, let me think of this through a little bit differently. There's that. But what what a horrible place for us to be in, as Martha has just described with our leadership. And I personally just say, speaking out every day, I don't see how killing innocent people gets us anywhere. I just don't. And it is terrible to see the state of Israel born as it was, coming out of what it did, not being able to treat, not to be able to treat people differently. And I know I'm not living there, and I didn't lose my family on October 7th, and I know, but I'm willing to work on it here where I can.
I'm looking at the words behind you, Irene, humanities for humans. I am drawn constantly just to that basic question. If we're dealing with humans, isn't that something that we have in common? That we are humans? Yeah. Isn't that a starting point? And I'll just say one thing about that. The extraordinary group, Doctors Without Borders, was in Rwanda on the ground when the genocide was unrolling and unfurling. And the local head, Dr. James Orbinski, anticipated that all of the children who were being housed in a hospital were at risk. And he went to the head of the hospital and he said, I fear that the machetes are coming. It's terrible. We have to get these children to safety. And the doctor said, no, we can't do that. And so Orbinski said to the doctor, are you a parent? And the man opened up his wallet and had pictures of his children and was very proud of them. And then Dr. Orbinski said, well, these are children too. They're somebody's child. And then the head of the hospital said, no, they're cockroaches. And it was, in fact, that word and similar words in Rwanda, similar words during the Holocaust, similar words in Vietnam, similar words in Gaza, the demeaning, the subordination of human beings to being not human that allows people to do horrific things. Yeah. So I do think it's absolutely critical to resist that, to insist on recognizing people as humans. And you talk about scale. I mean, at least I can start with my own communications, how I talk.
Yeah, I would just also add, thank you for that, Martha, too. And I think see the movie Origins and read that book, Cast, and you'll feel even more about what you were just speaking to. In my own, just my inability to celebrate Hanukkah this year and light the candles, I just couldn't even do it. But I did write 8 murals, and I'll send that to you so they can go in the program notes. Because I do feel like thinking about the thing about the miracles is not denying the horror of the present, but also posing what it could be. And it does have I suppose, a bit of naivete in there. And it isn't like I say, and here's how you do it, but I could at least imagine it.
Imagination is so absolutely critical to think that it's possible it could be otherwise. I always say to my law students how critical it is to study history, comparative study, what other countries do and have done, and science fiction. Because to imagine other worlds, that's how the strengths of human beings, that's what we can do, even in the darkest times.
So one thing we can do is treat those around us as human beings. That seems really vital. And another is to imagine. And we use this imagination idea in a different session of Humanities for Humans, where we were talking about imagining anew the future of the earth. And both of these, a philosophy professor who does Native American studies also, and law, and also a cultural geographer who works with artists, were talking about how important imagination is to imagine that it could be different. Because if you can't imagine that it could be different, then we don't really have a chance of getting there. I would add another, was controversial at the time, but the idea that Jonathan Safran Foer, who was talking about how it's too late for the environment, but he was recommending that you find the local project that you could do something about. So if there's a park you love and they're threatening to turn it into a parking lot, then you can fight for that spot of green in your neighborhood. And I wonder if that's also the way towards hope that we can offer people. Can you practice these steps? Can you practice non-judgment? Can you practice respect? You brought up that word very early on, Martha. Can you speak from experience rather from authority? Can we be practicing all of that in situations over which we might have a small amount of control and have the hope that that will add up to something different? Or am I just being a complete optimist at this point?
I totally agree that hope is critical, and taking steps, taking action, which often seems more feasible, more imaginable, more doable when it's local, when it's small. But your comments also make me recall when Al Gore created the film about why the environmental challenges overwhelm people. He noticed that, and the film is so powerful on this, that people move very quickly either to denial or to feeling overwhelmed. It's too big, and therefore there's nothing I can do, and pessimism. So the challenge seems to me to manage our feelings so that we can act and we can imagine. So I again go to Liz, your comments about fear and trying to turn it into a resource as opposed to shutting down. I don't know how we do that. Are there practices for that?
Well, I actually was going to say, I think we even have to practice imagination. And these things that are so powerful, it's interesting to me how little we train in them, but we can. You know, I have a little essay, was Einstein a choreographer? Because he was so good at these thought experiments. And to me, his thought experiments is he was living in his imagination. And it felt similar to the way I live in mine when I'm in the midst of making something, and I can sit there and spend enormous amounts of time in my imagination. It's like a giant computer because I can delete, add, subtract, oh, that's terrible, let me try it again. You know, But it's a practice. Right. And they're like any practice, they're warm-ups, they're things, you know, just to keep at it so that in times of need, you don't have to wait for it to come unbidden. You actually have it. It is a tool. It is part of who you are. So I think, you know, working on not having the parking lot be, you know, turn it into a garden, an absolute form of practice. How many things are you practicing when you do that? Oh, I have to get out of bed and actually do something. I can't let myself be a pessimist today. Oh, I got to talk to my neighbor. Oh, I got to pick the person up who doesn't have a car. Oh, or maybe you're not. Maybe you're riding a bike instead of a car. But just saying all of those things count. Yeah. Towards building the kind of world that we want to be in. And often we dismiss them. And so that's that. And also, I also wanted to add just for a moment about judgment, because you mentioned, Irene, for a second, non-judgment. I actually think what I'm interested in is how we turn judgment into inquiry. Or when do we engage with our judgment? Because our judgment is telling us something's wrong. Our feeling, it's a signal. Like you signal, I'm sad, I'm happy, I'm this, I'm that. That's a signal. And then how quickly do I move to inquiry, which you can practice, and then use those questions to get us somewhere? Because I think, I mean, we, as far as I can tell, after teaching critical response all these years, judgments are like neutrinos. They're coming at us every second, and we're having them every second. So how we manage them is a good term to use, Martha. Yeah.
No, it's such a good point about practice. Elaine Scarry, who's a a professor of English at Harvard, wrote a book called How to Think in an Emergency. And it could have been a short book, could have been 2 words, you can't. But instead, it's a beautiful book that talks about you can't think in an emergency, so you have to practice ahead of time, which is exactly right, and then have it available. It is striking to me that I think I'm finding that young people actually need more practice in having conversations, knowing how to separate out the question from the statement, and how to read the emotions of the other person, how to be in the presence of another person who has emotions. And I don't know whether that was always true, but it seems like there's more need for actual practice on those kinds of activities. You know, a study coming out of MIT indicated that undergraduates would prefer, on the whole, to have asynchronous communications, because then they don't have to manage the feelings that somebody else has.
I can certainly say, as a teacher myself for many decades, that things have changed in terms of students' abilities to talk to adults. And the pandemic didn't help any, right? Because students they were able to do most things asynchronously. And conversations face to face have become more and more rare for the younger generation. They'd much rather text about arranging what they're going to do that evening. This is not a criticism of the younger generation. I think you brought up, Martha, that just the very structure of digital communication changed so much, but it could also be a call for all of us who are in those teacher positions about how important it is to help our students learn those skills. You've both talked about skills, about tools. Unfortunately, we're winding down. Are there examples of skills or tools that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet that we want to make sure we bring up before the end of this session?
Well, I'm working on something called the Atlas of Creative Tools. It's not public yet, but there many of the tools are, and I'm hoping to make that be a place where people could access all kinds of things. But what I really want to say is people already have their own. They don't know it. They'll call it intuition. I think your intuition is your knowledge super fast. And that if you do a kind of deep reflection, I'm inspired. I have to go one more step. What inspired you about this thing? And then you'll hear yourself say the thing that you want to practice. But I think people have a lot of tools. I like to say to people, go back over when you were saving yourself. Like, you know, a moment that happened and then you got out of it. You saved yourself. Well, what did you do? Those are the tools that will be of use. It's kind of like a mentality around that.
Mm-hmm. A different example, Martha, perhaps, or a different tool that I think we talked a little bit about love, and that hasn't come up so much today. Is there anything we need to say about love here today? I guess that's part of recognizing humans, right?
Yeah, I mean, love is a tall order. I don't think it could be commanded, but I do think that just the experience that I had after having a child and suddenly realizing everybody alive who's a human being, some mother went through this for them. And that certainly was something that I hold on to even when I'm having a difficult conversation with someone. Somebody went through a lot for you to be around. I guess I do think that there are important tools that we learn from the dispute resolution world. That's, you know, I started by talking about a mediator. Sometimes you can't do it alone. Sometimes you need somebody else to help orchestrate the conversation, set the ground rules to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and has an equal opportunity. And sometimes even an adjudicator, someone who will resolve a conflict. But I do think that there are practices that everyone can engage in about playing those roles in their own lives and being willing to have in essence, social contract. It says we have a conflict and we're going to have to solve it, so we're going to agree to solve it this way.
Those are really helpful, Martha. And I think people don't, the possibility that you learn about these things and then learn how to apply them. Like I used to think everybody knew, you just see this over here. Oh, I'll apply it over here. Actually, that's not the case. People actually, again, it's a form of practice. How do I make this make sense to me over here, make sense of in another way? And one of the ways I might do that in relationship to love is the work that we did with veterans. We spent quite a number of months working with veterans during the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War, but we built a piece around what was happening in Iran and Iraq at that time with veterans returning from those wars. One of the things I learned by talking to so many of them and being in circles with them is there seemed to be three things that happened to them and why they would sign up again. They didn't sign up again because of our political policy. They signed up again because there's a certain amount of risk, and risk is a wonderful thing. I mean, it can keep you on the edge, and I happen to love it too. So risk seemed important to them. But then purpose, like they had purpose, even, and that seemed like a lifeblood. And then the third thing was love. And they didn't always use the word love, but they loved their comrades. As did my father. When he talked about World War II, the only time he would talk about it was in relationship to this kind of love. So I don't think we do such a good job expanding the notion of what we mean by love to encompass, like even in my classrooms, I want my students to sit and I want them to love each other in the manner in which they can then support each other's ups and downs and growths and changes and all that stuff. And you can create that kind of world, actually. You can, but it's like watching them. They taught me so much as I listened to the ways in which that played out for them. So
we do have a question from the audience, someone who's actually writing from Tel Aviv, and says that I'm not sure what the it in this sentence is. I thought it would be neutral. Perhaps she means or he means this conversation. But the only condemnation was uttered about Israel. Why doesn't anyone condemn the atrocities of Hamas? And then this person continues on about academics, that reading about Jewish students, even those who are not espousing Zionism, are usually attacked by anti-Israel mobs. Can't you influence the authorities to prevent demonstrations and sponsor only discussion at which academics of various persuasions will encourage information about both sides to be discussed? I must admit that I will take that on myself first, because at Dartmouth College, I was very fortunate to have colleagues who immediately, literally on October 7th, got in touch with each other, professors of Middle Eastern studies, both Arabic studies and Jewish studies, who got together and said, we have to have discussions. And these big public forums happened at Dartmouth right away. But I am a little confused about the perception that only the atrocities of Israel are talked about, and also the perception that only Jewish students are having problems right now. That doesn't seem to be what I'm reading and hearing. Does either of you want to respond to that? You're both on American campuses. Yeah, Martha.
I should have been more explicit when I say recognizing the humanities of others. I certainly mean the hostages. And I certainly mean the Israelis who were killed, whether they were at a concert or they were at home in a kibbutz. I am appalled when I look at groups that claim to be feminists who deny that their rapes happen. So when I say recognize the humanity of others, I mean that. And I am absolutely outraged that there are, on my campus, people tearing down posters with the pictures of the hostages. But that's a perfect example of what I was trying to describe about not recognizing the humanity, treating them as cockroaches. The fact of someone taking down the poster is an acknowledgement that, oh my goodness, someone might actually recognize these are human beings. And so I'm very sympathetic to the writer's comments about can't we have discussions about the issues rather than protests. We do have a very strong commitment to free speech in this country. And that includes even on college campuses. I myself have been a big advocate of what we call time, place, and manner restrictions. I do not believe that there should be protests where people are eating or sleeping or studying. And that's consistent, in my view, with the rules that apply to public spaces, and I think it should apply to even private campuses. It is tough. It is tough. There are so many strong feelings right now. So some people just don't seem to be ready to have conversations.
Right. And I would just comment that it seems to be going in all directions, not just one. I guess that's the part that's been a little bit confusing to me. There's been a lot of anti-Islamism as well as anti-Semitism. Liz, please.
Right. It's just very, I feel for the person who wrote that. And I don't know that even this is adequate, but I mentioned these 8 days of miracles that I wrote. This is from day 3. And again, it may not meet the desires of the person who wrote, but on day 3, the miraculous return of those raped to death, their pelvis is now intact, their heads are back on their bodies, which bear no bruises from having been dragged through the streets. The bodies torn apart by bomb after bomb are back in place where they were put by God, by Allah, by Buddha, or by the divine sacred. In that case, you see me again framing bigger, but trying to include the specifics and the horrors of what happened.
Great. This is obviously a very sober place to be winding down this conversation, but I think we all were aware of that, right? We're in a very, very sobering moment in human history, it seems to me, where people are grasping at violence rather than seeing someone else's humanity. We all have, unfortunately, a lot of leaders, as you put it earlier, Martha, who don't want resolutions. And I think that is something perhaps each of us, at least in democratic societies that ours still marginally is, that we should think about. What does it mean to be supporting leaders who don't want resolution? And what are the different kinds of resolutions that are available to us that no one's talking about and pushing for that? I would just, we have a couple more minutes and I just would extend, is there one particular thing or example that either of you would like to throw out there quickly before we wind this down?
So I was very helped by Liz's suggestion, both in talking about critical response steps, but also just steps in general, about helping people, helping each of us to separate out things that we just immediately combine. And so just as an example, I've written a lot and worked on the issues of forgiveness. I think that it's absolutely critical to separate out honoring and recognizing people's justified sense of outrage and resentment being violated. Forgiveness, whatever it is as an aspiration that's embraced by every religion, every philosophic tradition, it means letting go of a justified resentment. So first of all, let's recognize the justified resentment.
I love that, Martha. You've told me that before. I'm really glad that you raised that again just now. It's really, really good, as is the 4 definitions of truth that you brought to my attention that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission used in order to do that work. And we should put that in the show notes too, so people can see what that is.
That's right. So the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think, very powerfully articulated that there are different kinds of truth. It's not relativism to acknowledge that there is forensic truth, there is personal narrative truth, there's social truth that emerges from dialogue, and there's truth that's constructed in healing processes. And they're not the same, and they're all important.
Well, that seems like a really great way to end this, if we have to end. And we actually do. We try to keep our time contract with the audience. I want to give my huge personal thanks to both of you for sharing and using words that are very carefully chosen that can help us frame our own emotions, urges, desires, inspirations. I want to thank our sponsors again, 1014 Space for Ideas in New York and the Walter de Gruyter Foundation in Berlin. And a huge thanks to all of you online listeners who came. I do want to remind you that we will have a recording of this conversation up within the next few days. So please let these beautiful messages, these steps that all of us can be taking, be spread as far and wide as possible. Tell your friends, your acquaintances, your students, your teachers about this recording, which will be made available for quite a long bit of time into the future, as well as the reading, viewing list that we have that has quite a few interesting things to look at, as well as to read. I would also just remind those of you who are still able to be listening that there will be a registration link up soon for the last session of Humanities for Humans to be held in person in New York on the evening of May 6th at 1014 Fifth Avenue. And the topic will be very much in line with where we ended today's discussion: organized religion, religious hate, and secular societies. And we'll be conversing with Professor Susanna Heschel of Dartmouth College and Terence Johnson of the Harvard Divinity School. So thank you all, especially Liz and Martha. And we're going to call it a midday, an evening, or a morning, depending on where you are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.